Actually, the potential upside from a social point of view in terms of data protection and identity, that's a really strong positive social impact.
Firstly, welcome Simon to this our latest edition of Sense of Identity. I always enjoyed doing this podcast, but I've been particularly looking forward to chatting to you, Simon, for reasons I hope that the listeners will similarly appreciate as we trundle through the dialogue. But if I may initially, can I just do a bit of an intro?
Yeah, sure, please do. Yeah, no, great to be here, and I've been looking forward to it too, Paul. Yeah, it's going to be fun.
And I've got to say, I was looking at your bio before this in terms of how the hell do I introduce you. So I'll do my best, but I can't do this justice at all. But so I'm Professor Simon Pringle. Firstly, a professor on twice over, from what I understand, including honorary professor of the University of Edinburgh Business School.
Yep.
An associate fellow of Chatham House. Obviously, one who uses this Chatham House rule. Well, there you go. That's where that comes from. Do look it up. From our perspective as a business, I mean, we've all known each other a long time, and as a specialist in the sustainability arena, we sought your expertise and input some time ago, actually, when we were putting together a report around sustainability, ESG, those letters we're going to come back to later on, for some research you very kindly collated for us, which was extraordinary, actually, really interesting. And we had an event last summer in Soho where the great and the good of the financial services industry came along to look at some of the outputs there, and that all really started by way of this relationship. But just to sort of set the scene, there can be very few people that can boast 30 years of experience and knowledge in the sustainability sector. When I've sort of looked this up before, I'm struggling to find anybody else that can be you can act as a reference point, with such credentials as you, Simon. So as I say, very grateful for you putting some time aside to
No, it's great, and thoroughly enjoyed doing that piece of work with you. And yeah, I mean, there are other people that have been around for as long as I have, but it's a relatively small group, and I guess we probably all know each other or know of each other one way or another. So yeah, that's true.
Very good. And we've had an interesting chat with a group circling around this topic before, which I thought was really interesting. Just to slightly continue that before we start, I start posing a few questions.
Yeah,
you've been involved, as far as I understand, with the CBI. In terms of some of the toolkits they put together, how they help companies innovate but be green. Involved in IMEC from a CleanTech perspective. UK Food Task Force, and some of these things date back decades, actually, in terms of talk about being ahead of your time. But really worthy of note. I guess where I wanted to start, if it's okay with you, is that when I started reading up on your bio and this sector again, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that the sort of requirements for companies to start really not just playing this lip service to get real about this dates back a long time. I think back in 2006 there were some obligations that started to be placed upon large companies in this area. And I know COP26 obviously is the flagship, shall we say, event that at least brought some more emphasis to the topic, but there were no legal obligations that came out there. And yet for me, it still feels like, there's a lot to do to help get the message out. And I wonder whether you could give us perhaps a bit of benefit of your experience over all those years as to what you have seen change, what you haven't, those sorts of things, just as a starter, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. No, glad to. I guess one of the consistent themes, over that period is the interplay between kind of regulatory and non-regulatory, or compliance and non-compliance drivers. And you're right, people tend to focus understandably on where the regulatory constructs are and what the reporting and transparency requirements are. And we are going to be seeing, increased scrutiny and increased requirements around that as SASB and the sustainability disclosure standards come through, as they're expected to in the coming months, never mind coming years. And so that's going to place far greater emphasis on organisations, not just on listed businesses, because these things tend to cascade down into non-listed entities in terms of expected behaviour and good corporate governance and so on. But also, what we have experienced, this is not just a here and now piece. This is pretty much consistent over the last decade or so, is that the non-regulatory drivers are at least as powerful and sometimes more powerful than the regulatory ones. And that would be in terms of supply chain pressure, the expectations that clients will place upon their suppliers, that customers will place upon the providers of goods and services, the way that peer groups operate, and basically raise a standard through sort of collective action. A lot of that can actually be almost more influential from a boardroom point of view, particularly when we're looking at the brand equity of an organization, the way in which it's valued, the legacy of a chief exec or leadership team. All that sort of thing plays into this agenda really strongly. And I think what we're seeing right now, the kind of theme of the day is this kind of integration of thinking. So a step away from well-intended but isolated initiatives into a much more joined up, sort of commercially focused, governance focused approach. And that's where I think people's expectations are moving to.
And just picking up slightly on that, hopefully for you to continue, the cascading down piece. We chatted about this briefly before.
Yeah.
That it feels like there's definitely an eye towards this topic, a serious eye towards this topic. You've seen a lot of new posts in terms of chief sustainability officers. So companies are having to take this seriously because their customers or their customers' care and want to see companies treating things in the right way. Do you think that sort of cascading down is happening the way it should do yet? Is the message getting through to I think you use the phrase boots on the ground, to people that are...
Yeah, right. So there's a couple of things in that, I guess. So if we think about a lot of the standards and the reporting frameworks, and it's a GRI and some of the other standards that are out there, a lot of those were designed around the largest businesses in the world, the Rio Tintos of this world, and so on. Well, that's perfectly understandable. I've got no implied criticism of that at all. That's an important place to start. And large, fully listed entities have, had the resource and the scrutiny and the transparency that's been required of them. Not always perfectly, but they've been very much in the spotlight for much longer than the rest of the market, and they've got people like you and me and other colleagues kicking around within their corporate structures that allow them to have the capacity to deal with this complex agenda. So what has happened recently, of course, is that the scrutiny has fallen into the upper and to the mid market in a way that it probably didn't do 5 or 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, and that's really just a function of the whole agenda maturing in to the top of the market, as it were, and then being manifest into the mid market as well. But the other kind of suggestion, I suppose, within your question is, how consistent is this agenda lived? How to what extent does it sort of become a cultural norm within large organisations? And I think what we experience at the moment is that there are some clearly that are doing this really, really well and have interwoven it right across the fabric of their organisation. But it's not uncommon to find some, businesses across all sectors that are really strong, really advanced, really progressive, right at the centre. So the thought leadership that's put out, the conversations that happen around the boardroom table, that sort of thing, the stakeholder engagement that goes on, can be really on point and relevant to the sector they're operating in and addressing material issues and so on. But actually, it doesn't permeate the organisation, and so the day-to-day experience that customers or other kind of service users or suppliers, or whatever it might be, have is entirely different, because the experience of an organisation's commitment to sustainability, ESG, and those two things are slightly different. We might pick up on that later on if you like, but it's really defined by the person that they're engaging with. And if that person isn't part of this conversation, then how real is it, on a day-to-day basis? So I think we have a situation now where we've got a bit of a split between highly progressive core and less engaged sort of edge of business or customer-facing edges of business in some instances, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the other observation for me, the chief sustainability officers that we've come into contact with directly, there's real passion. There's real passion in making a difference, and but from their perspective, it must be hard, because there's, from an experience perspective, I mean, it's great they've got people like you to be able to call upon, to be frank, but at an experience level, they need experience of their businesses to be able to drive those themes in the right way. But but as a market, as an understanding, there's an immaturity around it. And it must be hard. I'm making an outside observation for them to make real change. There's material, so I just wonder how you break that chain, how you then get that communication, that cascading effect actually starts.
Well, this is where we shift the discussion into one about leadership, really, and as with any change, whether it's ESG, sustainability, or anything else, if that drive is not sponsored from the top of an organisation, and if the leadership team of the organisation is not fully vested in that and leading in their own particular areas, then it almost doesn't matter how good the chief sustainability officer is. That person is going to struggle, clearly, because they risk being a kind of a lone voice in a cultural wilderness in that respect. So where we see real change happening is that person being a catalyst, but working alongside, supported by, and advocated for by the chief exec, the MD, the departmental heads, however the business is structured. In the absence of that, that's a real challenge. And so one of the things that's coming through now is a recognition of the needs to help leaders almost unlearn some of what they've learned previously and start relearning what's going to be required going forwards across this whole agenda, so that they can build their proper legacy. They can invest in the in the culture that they need and in the brand equity of the organisation, and become a success story in the future, rather than end up with a slightly shortened shelf life, which is
it's an obvious of a project. Absolutely, yeah. You hinted at something a second ago, which is the perfect segue, actually. So thank you. We hadn't rehearsed this, which is brilliant. But there was some, and I don't want to take credit for something you said to me previously. So I just want to make sure what I'm just about to say is not my thinking. Just to be clear, everyone talks about environmental, social, and governance, and when we ramble in our other discussions around the market that we are most prevalent in, I guess, the professional services market, where there's lots of sensitive data, being used day to day. People deal with people. It's a very people, culture, ethos. If you're in the financial advisory market, if you're a product provider in wealth, you're an accountant, you're a lawyer. The truth is, those markets are actually pretty heavily governed. And something you mentioned, I thought, which I'd really love you to take us back through, if you don't mind, was there's probably merit in reversing those letters. This was something you said to me, not the other way around. Just to be clear to everyone that's listening, that this should be sometimes GSE. Would you mind just taking us back through your thinking?
Yeah, that was
really interesting.
No, that's fine. I just think the fact that we refer to ES&G, and for folks who are listening who are not entirely familiar with this, we talk about sustainability, we talk about ES&G, and the sustainability agenda tends to be sort of best understood through a bit of a strategy lens. How do we reconsider business models? How do we look at our supply chain? How do we look at the circular economy in the context of this business, whatever it might be? So, whereas ES&G stands for environment, social, and governance, and oftentimes that's easier to understand through a risk lens. How do we take the business model we've got but make it as effective as possible, de-risk it, reduce any sort of negative impacts that it has, enhance the positive impacts it can have, and so on and so forth. So whilst they're often used interchangeably, there is a subtle difference there. I think we tend to use ESG just because we're in the habit of putting it in that order, and also to some extent because there had been some primacy around environmental data, and that's because a lot of the aspects of of reporting from an environmental point of view are quite tangible. Buildings are easy to measure. They have the good grace of standing still and letting you measure them, right? Carbon is a currency unit in essence. It's the same in the UK as it is in Argentina, as it is in Thailand. It doesn't make any difference where that carbon molecule is emitted from, and so on and so forth. So to an extent, the E part of the ES&G is a little bit easier to get into a spreadsheet and report than the S part. The S part's harder because we look for proxy indicators and ways of measuring social impact. Sometimes it's real data, sometimes it's indicators, and so on. And I think that was really brought very firmly to the fore during the pandemic years, whereas previously some people might argue that we had a capital E and a capital G and a lowercase s oftentimes in terms of ES&G. But we only put them in that order for habit, and because it's easier to say, actually, in some respects. And I think there is a really valid argument, particularly in certain sectors, FS, professional services and others to say, well, actually, you can't have a meaningful social or environmental program unless you've got your governance in order, particularly the social side of things, actually. And so thinking about the governance side as a kind of foundational stone upon which we build the social and the environmental makes a lot of sense. And it's just a running order, isn't it? And we've seen this happen in the past, right? So folks who've been around this agenda for a long time will remember that we used to talk about environment, health and safety. Sometimes we talk about health, safety and environment. Sometimes we talk about safety, health and environment. And actually what the order of those letters did was just gave you a clue as to where the primary focus of any given organisation was. So a chemical industries firm would probably talk about safety, health and environment because that was primary to them. An environmental sort of contaminated land business would probably talk about environment, health and safety. Now, that's not to say that one's right and the other's wrong. It's not. They're just contextual, aren't they? And so it's the same with this. So in a kind of FS, professional services space, governance has to come first. We've got to have that bedrock to build on. And actually, given the value propositions that you and all your clever folks in Beyond Encryption have been evolving, the social side of that is going to will certainly have a greater impact than the environmental side. I mean, clearly there's going to be an additive benefit environmentally in terms of decarbonisation of mail and print and post and so on. But actually the potential upside from a social point of view in terms of data protection and identity and the way in which people can live a life that's sort of unaffected by attempts to sort of hack them or steal their identity or skim their money or whatever it happens to be. Well, that's a really strong positive social impact. So it sort of makes sense to go GSE in that context.
Yeah. And I think also, and again, particularly thinking on our school industries, let's say we touch lots of different industries, which is great, but where we started this whole story from our perspective was very much in a highly governed market. The advisory market, it's not easy to be a financial advisor these days. You've got to be, as with the legal market, accountancy, adequately qualified, experienced, and all those things. But I think as a market, it's more used to dealing with governance as a lead topic, and if that governance process can lead to a positive environmental and social impact, then it sort of almost feels that that's maybe where you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck, if you know what I mean. And you talked briefly there about the sort of decarbonisation piece and at a government level, and obviously with COP26, and I always refer back to that one because it seemed to again have the loudest voice from a marketing perspective, and I know there's been obviously subsequent pieces. But do you at a government level, do you think that's going to evolve? Do you think they're going to get sharper teeth in terms of all of these themes and forcing companies to act in the right way?
Yeah, well, gosh, that's a question that we could talk for an hour on alone, actually. But so it depends on where we're talking about. If we're talking about from a UK point of view or a UK and EU perspective, then yes. A lot of people are focused on the net zero 2050 target. What's easy to overlook is that we have a 2030 target. Now, 2030 is really not that long away. And looking at a decarbonisation of 78%, I think it is, by 2030 is huge. That's more challenging than the 2050 target. I mentioned before, we have we've had some outline sort of consultation drafts around sustainability disclosure standards, which are likely to come through during the course of this year into early next on a practical level. Statutory audits are requiring an increased focus around carbon, around decarbonisation. So as soon as we've got those points of leverage in play, reporting, auditing, the way in which banks price their cost of capital, all that sort of thing, layers on in a way that's that sort of points in the same direction as the overlying sort of statutory obligations that we have. The thing to sit alongside that, I guess, is initiatives. One of the big changes is around this whole concept of science-based targets, and that came through from COP26 very strongly, where there was a more consistency around the guidelines for the guidance documents around how to set science-based targets. And from a corporate point of view, the expectation has really shifted that if you are telling a decarbonisation or a carbon reduction story without a science-based target associated with it. And a science-based target means that it's aligned to the Paris Agreement and the restricting temperatures to 1.5 or substantially below 2 degrees and so on. That is a really meaningful and robust and rigorous piece of work that needs to underpin claims that organisations are making. So very soon we are going to be a long way away from kind of slightly aspirational, arbitrary, ambitious sort of claims about how quickly an organisation will be decarbonising, to a place where it's saying, well, show us exactly how you're going to do it and link it to the Paris Agreement, and that has to be independently verified and so on and so forth. So that expectation shift, that's one of those non-regulatory changes, right? So you've got a regulatory piece and you've got a non-regulatory piece coming through, and then you've also got governmental entities showing different types of leadership. I mean, actually in your world, the one that was reminded of is, of course, Norway's done some really quite interesting things. I mean, they've kind of made Oslo car free first, and it's a bit easier. I mean, they've got slightly fewer people living in Norway than we have here in the UK, but also they, from a government post point of view, they've digitised their entire postal service. And well, that's an intervention. It's one thing, but it has a really meaningful impact, and it also stimulates change elsewhere. And of course, I guess it's something that would be quite helpful from your perspective as well, to see that type of leadership from state actors one way or another.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd sort of circling that piece there where you talked about claims organisations are making. There was something else, we actually haven't spoken about this before, but that I was reading about. I mean, we've been going through the process of B Corp, which has been in flow for quite some time, actually. I think we joined the queue, as it were, at a point when there was a particular bubble or burst of activity around that. Yeah, we were part of that too, and I think we're close, which is great. And there's a real, as a business, I would say, looking into our business, there's a genuine drive and appetite at an individual personal level for the people in our business. They've totally and utterly bought into the whole fact that we need to be part of the solution, part of the positive piece. One of the things I thought would be just quickly interesting to talk about was that there has been some adverse comments around B Corp. I attended a meeting recently, and actually they very fairly explained their position on, I think there was a particular coffee company that had achieved B Corp. It's prevalent in its plastics usage, I think, without going too far down that line. The point they made when they were questioned on it was the fact that that company had and was making very positive strides to change its business model with that backdrop in mind, and therefore it was justified in being part of B Corp because it was on a path to change in a positive way. Nonetheless, that keeps coming back. People love to wave a red flag at things and poo-poo ideas. You know what the world's like. What are your thoughts around B Corp and some of those challenges they face and companies face when they're getting involved with B Corp?
That's a good question, actually. I think, we'll come back to B Corp in a moment, but I think it sort of almost provokes a slightly wider question, doesn't it? Or prompts a wider question in some respects. And as this whole agenda has become more visible to more people, I'm not saying it's become more important. It was really important a long time ago. It's just people weren't
30 years ago when you started.
They just weren't listening. It's just become more visible and more audible to a lot of individuals. It does prompt lots of different responses, right? And so the old adage that quite a lot of strategies of sustainability fail because they're not strategies in the first place. They're just a loose assembly of aspirations and ambitions and with a bunch of data that happens to exist but doesn't necessarily speak to the material issues that an organisation needs to address. I mean, that is still the case. We are still vulnerable to greenwashing, and there's been some excellent work done recently, actually not by me, excellent work done identifying the different types of greenwashing. So it's not just out and out over lying. It can be kind of almost like green distraction. So having an initiative, a bright shiny thing over here to distract you away from what's going on in the core. It can almost be about, it's almost like a gaslighting version of sort of greenwashing, which is to say, well, don't worry about us as a corporate, think about what you can do as a consumer. So there's all sorts of things like that going on that people are sensitive to, quite rightly. And the temptation then is only to sort of place focus or kind of celebrate to an extent those organisations that are entirely pure And there are very, very few of those. And so I think for me, where I get passion from is working with organisations that are genuinely committed. So if there's an integrity gap, i.e. if it's kind of, well, we're going to deal with this bit, but over here we're just going to carry on belching out pollutants and, you know, spewing carbon into the world, but over here we want to get this bit really right, so can you help us with this bit? No, absolutely not. You know, this has got to be thoroughly well intended. It's got to be packed full of integrity. It's got to be joined up thinking. It's got to be something that will over time transform. And a lot of organizations are moving from this why thinking to what. You know, why do we have to do it? Well, if you're still asking why, probably you need to do a little bit more reading on your own. What? Well, that can be quite a difficult question for some organizations, but many organizations are now into this sort of space of how do we do it? And then critically, how fast do we do it? And so that then brings us to the question you were asking in many ways, which is that how fast can companies realistically transition? And, you know, if we're always only just sort of preaching to the choir, then actually we're losing the opportunity to help organizations that are making a significantly negative impact change in a positive way. So I do have sympathy for that mindset, as long as it's underpinned by a genuine
real, yeah,
commitment and integrity and sort of, you know, leadership appetite and a long-term strategy, and critically a meaningful plan, ideally one that's got, you know, some deliverable aspects to it.
I have a suspicion that might be something that you're called upon quite regularly to provide counsel on. You know, if your plan's not credible and is distracting, ultimately that will be damaging when you're found out. You know, you either walk the walk, as they say, or don't bother because otherwise you're gonna probably do more damage than good. But personally, sorry. I thought the explanation they gave was actually a really good one. You know, just like you say, looking at the success stories alone is not going to change the need. You know, not going to move the needle. You've got to be working with the companies that are on a journey to improve maybe a pole position. Even, you know, some people have aimed at this particular instance, I think. But I thought the argument that they were committing to make a change in a positive sense is equally important. So it made sense,
and they need to do that as quickly as they realistically can. But then, you know, we are now in a space, we're now in a world of trade-offs, right? So we've run out of time. It's a bit like, you know, one of the kind of analogies I've used in the past, it's a bit like, you know, people sort of saving for their retirement, and you know, it's fine being told you should put money into a pension when you're in your 20s. If you get into your mid-50s and you haven't started yet, then you could still do it, but it's going to be financially very painful. Well, we've been talking about dealing with, you know, climate and environment issues for the last 30 years. So that analogy works, and people have been ignoring it. And there's still time to do it, but you're going to have to do it really quickly, and it's going to be a bit painful if you haven't started yet. Simple as that.
It makes sense, yeah. Listen, talking about running out of time, it's quite amazing just how much time we've gone through tonight. So I'm gonna use that as a good segue into a couple of things. Bring this back to that sense of identity, because I was thinking, you know, the feedback we get from people on these sessions is actually nice to get to know the people. I learned a couple of things about you, which I didn't know about. So one, we both got a passion for music, but I understand you're a bass player. I think you sing in a band or have sung in a band, and tell us a bit about that just quickly, just so that.
It's true. I must have let that one slip at some point. Yeah, I do. I do play bass, and I do sing. Yeah, in
what sort of music is that?
Well, at the moment, I'm in a really quite a large rock gospel choir. There's a 120 person choir, so I sing in the bass section of that, and it's great. It's a fantastic energy. Yeah, so I do. I come from a family of musicians, so I am the least talented of my family. All of the rest of them are much more talented than I am. But it's a very musical family and a very noisy house as well as a result of that. So.
That's a good thing. The last one, if I may, and I genuinely would like to carry this on for a lot longer, but keeping things in check.
Yeah.
The question I always ask people at these sessions, and they've been really insightful, the answers, is if you could give your younger self a bit of advice, maybe not just one, by the way, if you think of a couple, then please feel free, but what would be that piece of advice you'd give your younger self with all the knowledge you've accrued over the years?
It would be to not to be scared to focus on the things that really drive a passion and create a really sort of positive energy for the younger Simon, and in many instances I guess I did, but clearly there's always more that we could do in that respect, and also to speak really openly and to be bold in terms of sharing perspectives and views. And I think for people who are perhaps in the earlier parts of their career, sometimes that can feel a bit challenging. And I don't think it's too early to start expressing a view and really leaning in with passion and energy to things that are sort of inspiring and keep you driving forwards. Because if you do that, you're going to succeed much more quickly, I think, because it's just going to be a really sort of positive, energizing experience. So that's the sort of advice I'd give, I think.
I think that's great advice. There's been a similar note on another point, which is that people that are really passionate about a subject tend to be brilliant at it. And to be frank, to close out this conversation, personally, I think that perfectly describes you, Simon. I've never met anyone as passionate about this subject as you, and these sessions are always really insightful for me. So thanks so much again for today. And I hope we'll be able to get you back sometime to talk a little bit further. But for now, thanks, Simon.
It's very kind. Thanks for the time. I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Paul.